Thanks very much for having me here today. What I thought I'd talk about, roughly three things. One is what has been happening since the election on June the 2nd. A lot of things the new government has been setting up. I've been setting things up. All the newly elected MPs have been setting things up. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I wanted to talk about some of the major issues, the major things that the Ontario legislature should be working on. And I know the government is working on these things over the next few years, because these are the important things that are affecting so many people in a very serious way in their daily lives. And then I want to talk lastly about how I would like to approach this work, how I would like to do politics, to try to address what I think needs to be addressed, and that is the polarization in society, the political polarization, and the difficulty that different people in society have in talking to each other and working together. Because I believe that we need to work together to attack some of our trickiest problems. So let me start with what's been happening since the election. In the election, I ran for the Ontario Liberal Party, and the Ontario Liberals had a very bad election. I was talking to the campaign manager for the Liberals, and she said, you know, the lowest possible number of seats we thought we would get from our internal projections and models was 15, and we only got 8 seats. So it was a bad election for the Ontario Liberal Party. Since I've been elected, I've been setting up my office, and more importantly, hiring, training, and getting my staff to work together as a team, to just understand all the tools that are potentially there for helping people who come in with problems with driver's licenses or lost ID or some problem with income tax. All of these things people come in with, all of these problems people come in with. So I had to interview, find potential candidates to work for me, interview them, hire them, try to get a good selection of people. One of my employees is going to move to Toronto to be my legislative assistant in Queen's Park. I've invested a considerable amount of time and money into getting some training for my staff so that they can start to help people as soon as possible. And right after Election Day on June the 2nd, I would get some congratulatory messages on the next day, but also people needing help. There are a lot of people who need help. Something has gone wrong with the way the Ontario government or the bureaucracy is supposed to work. There's some snafu, and so it's up to us to help them through it. Or sometimes people just don't know how the Ontario government works, and they just need a little help. So they contact us, and we try our best to give them the information that they need. I am currently temporarily in the office that was occupied by former Mpp Ian Arthur, and before him Sophie Koala, and before him John Gerritsen. I have to move out of there because they're going to be renovating the ground floor of the LaSalle Muse building. So I'll be moving to a new office. This is also complicating the whole setup. I'll be moving to a new office beside Mark Gerritsen in a couple of months, starting around the beginning of October. The Liberal caucus, the number of Liberal MPs is 8. So we have had a couple of meetings to try to set things up. It's really important for caucus members to work together and to work as a team, because there are so many areas of policy that need to be covered. In fact, the government has some large number of ministers, around 20 or 30. I don't know the exact number right now. So they have one elected person for each of these policy areas. And normally in an opposition, you would have about one elected person to keep tabs on the minister. And we only have 8. So each of us is going to have about 4 or 5 areas we have to keep track of. And it's going to be hard to do it on our own. So I've been trying to recruit some volunteers to help. You know, if a bill gets tabled and I need somebody to help me read it and maybe look into some of the background, there are some volunteers who can help with that. So I'm trying to recruit those people. The caucus has been getting together. We only recently selected a new interim leader because the previous leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, Stephen Del Duca. He resigned, or said he was going to resign on election day. And now we're going to have a new interim leader, John Fraser. Actually, he's the old new interim leader. He was the interim leader after the 2018 election, so he's going to serve as the interim leader again. We still haven't decided on our critic portfolio, so the ministers that we have to keep tabs on. We'll be deciding that very soon, I think, now that we have an interim leader in place. The Ontario legislature, normally, according to the established calendar, would meet in September. So after the election, normally the government takes time to get organized. All the new MPPs take time to learn the ropes, hire their staff, train them, and so on. But this government has just been re-elected. It had a budget in April, which was tabled, but it really wasn't debated and voted on. It didn't go through committee, or wasn't looked at very closely. It was more like an election platform for the Progressive Conservative Party in this past election. So on August the 8th, the legislature will be recalled for the first time. I think it's the 42nd Ontario Parliament, anyways, something like that. On August the 8th, the first thing the legislature does is elect its speaker. And Mr. Milliken is here, he knows all about that. I've already been lobbied by one of the candidates for speaker who gave me a phone call and said, please vote for me, I will do this and this and this. So it's a bit of a contest. In fact, it's the only secret ballot that there is in the legislature, is the vote for speaker. On the second day, August the 9th, there should be a throne speech table where the government, Premier Ford's government, will outline their agenda for the next few years. There will be a debate over that. It'll probably be a debate over what should be prioritized and what's missing that the government didn't put in the throne speech, things like that. On Wednesday, it is anticipated that the new budget will be tabled. So there will be a whole debate over that. And there are some other legislation expected because the government has started to announce some of the things they would like to do this fall. We'll be sitting for about 5 weeks, so into the beginning of September, before we have any breaks from this first session. But this will be the first time that there will be question period and scrums, press scrums in front of the legislative chamber. It'll be the first time that the opposition will publicly and in person be able to hold the government to account, whether it's in question period or in committees or wherever. So that is what's going to happen in the legislature. The main issues that I would like to focus on are the ones that people talked about when I went knocking on their doors. And they won't be a surprise to you because I think all of you will have either experienced this directly or know somebody who's had to struggle with this. Number one would be housing and the cost of living. Housing continues to be, I would say, a fundamental to a lot of problems in society. A lot of problems in society are made worse because of the lack of affordable housing. One of the things that I've heard a lot about already, people writing in, phoning in, is that there's a big backlog at the landlord and tenant board. So, and that is a result of, it's partly because of the pandemic and the disruption. There are many people who, for one reason or another, they can't stay where they are. And there are many different reasons why, but there's no place to go to. And so you can't just kick somebody out of a place. There has to be a process. And so there's a lot of things happening at the landlord and tenant board. Things are very, very delayed. But the fundamental reason why this is happening because there's no place for people to go to. So we have to have more housing made available. And right, the job of the opposition is to keep tabs on the government and make sure that they are doing everything they can to make sure that there's more affordable housing for people. Cost of living overall is another thing. One thing that I'm going to keep my eye on. I've heard so many people on who are disabled and they're on the ODSP, the Ontario Disability Support Program, which Basically, it works something like this. It pays for your rent, and then you have about $300 left over for a month. So you have $10 a day to live on after your rent is covered. That's like roughly what you get. And that hasn't gone up in the last 2 or 3 years. So there's been no inflation adjustment. It's fallen far behind inflation. And that's one of the places where there's the most suffering of people who are, they may already have more expenses than the average person because of their disability. It's hard for them to get around. It's hard for them to go shopping to get the cheapest prices on groceries, things like that. So I've heard from so many people on ODSP they send me in their income statements. Like many people, they just send me, they tell me exactly what their income is. I guess they get a statement from the Ontario government, and it is one of the most difficult things to read is the story. So Doug Ford, Premier Ford, to his credit, during the election campaign, he said, okay, he promised to raise the ODSP supports by 5%. It wasn't in the April budget, but he's going to put it in this budget coming up. Now, I'm hoping that it's more than 5% because inflation is actually a lot more than 5%, especially inflation on the things that really are basic, like housing and food. So that's one of the things I want to keep track of when it comes to cost of living, as well as a long-term approach to fighting increases in the cost of living. And long-term, we have to focus on the productivity of workers. The more productive we are, the more we can produce with the same amount of hours worked or the same amount of money invested. And we need to do that in order to keep down the price of the goods and services that people produce. We have to help people become more productive. So to the government's credit, they do recognize that we have a lack of people in the skilled trades. So if you don't have enough carpenters, for example, it's no surprise that housing costs more. If you don't have carpenters, you have to pay up. Maybe you have to hire them from some other province. Or so to the government's credit, it is doing some things in that area, but we want to hold the government accountable, make sure it's doing everything it can to keep down the prices of things. Now, one really interesting thing, my predecessor, Ian Arthur, who's my predecessor as MPP, he didn't just retire, he's doing something really interesting. He and some friends have started a company that uses 3D printing technology to print houses. It's new, innovative technology. They bought some equipment from Europe. They've learned to use it to suit the Canadian requirements. And I really hope he succeeds because he is cutting down the cost of certain kinds of housing by 3D printing the walls and all the holes you need to put the wires and the plumbing through. So they've got I think that they're in the process of building the first 3D printed house which has a basement on Wolf Island. And then they're going to do they're going to print the first 3D building in North America which has 2 stories. I think they're going to do that somewhere in Kingston. So look out for that. That's one of those innovative things that we need to do to produce things at lower cost. And that will hold down inflation, the inflation that everybody is feeling. The other thing is area that I want to focus on. Let me just list them all first, because I don't want to talk about it. So it's healthcare capacity in many, and I'll talk more about that. It's the disruption to education and the need to recover from that so that our kids don't suffer from the disruption in their education for the rest of their lives. You know, if you don't do anything about it, you're going to have lower high school graduation rates in 5-6 years. People are going to have trouble competing for jobs and so on. So we have to work on that. So those, and climate change is another issue that I think is important to work on. But let me talk about healthcare capacity as one more thing, because there are many facets to this. I have an aunt who's on a waiting list for long-term care. So many people are on waiting lists for long-term care. We're going to have to figure out how to provide long-term care, but provide it in a way that is as cost-effective as possible. So the government's plan is to simply build more institutions like we have now. But there are many people say there's other ways of doing things that make people feel more like they're at home, help people socialize more and keep people more active. We also need to make sure the government supports people at home. So if you pay a little bit of money to keep somebody at home so that they don't have to move into long-term care so soon, maybe you can keep people at home for an extra 6 months to a year. And that's a lot cheaper than having a room in an institution and having all the staff around. So there are many things that we need to do in that area. You know right now that the hospitals are overwhelmed. Every day, if you're involved in human resources in the hospital, every day you're hearing of people who, if they're not quitting, they're coming in to talk about quitting and about the stress they're experiencing and how they feel like either quitting or maybe retiring a bit earlier. So that is a big challenge. And right now, you may have heard that the urgent care at Hotel Dieu, they've restricted themselves to 120 patients a day. And so they're trying, they don't want to hurt anybody, but they're trying to protect their own staff so that their staff don't burn out and just completely quit and then put more pressure on everybody who's left. So that is, I think, a real important priority for the Ontario government to address this issue with hospitals, but it's connected to everything else. So for example, you might want to relieve the pressure on hospitals by putting more resources into family doctors and the family doctors' offices so that people don't need to go into emergency because they've gone earlier to see their family doctor. You could relieve the pressure on family because we're short of family doctors. So that's a lot of things we got to do there. But you could also relieve the pressure on family doctors by allowing pharmacists to do a few more things, maybe write a few more like really common prescriptions. That's one thing that people are looking at. You could also, here's one that people don't think of, put more prisons. Because when a prisoner, oops, what happened? Did I do something wrong? Oh, there we go, okay. Because when prisoners, I don't know if you've seen, when prisoners go to urgent care in the hospital, there's like 3 or 4 correctional staff and you've got to have security in the hospital, and it takes a lot of people when a prisoner has to go to the hospital. So if there's some way of putting more resources into healthcare in the prisons to keep them from going to emergency or to urgent care, that would help as well. So there's a lot of little things that we can do, and I'm hoping that to push the government and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? To try to get the government to act faster than it otherwise would, or maybe just to, I talk to people, I come up with an idea. It takes a while for those ideas to percolate up to the ministry, but if I've talked to somebody, I can walk across the aisle after question period and I can say, hey, minister, I just heard this great idea. And so I'm a way of reaching somebody at the top. And then the minister will go to the staff and say, hey, I just heard from this other MPP about this idea that somebody, at the prisons in Kingston said, well, we should do something like this. So there's a role for me in not just criticizing the government, but informing the government about alternatives. And I could do it publicly, or I could go privately to the minister. There's a place for each. There's a place where you stand up in question period, or you talk to a reporter and you say, the government is forgetting to do this and they've got to do it differently. Or you can go privately up to a minister and say, here's something that you can do that would really help people. Let me explain it to you. And sometimes that works better. In fact, I've had a lot of success when I was an MP in the House of Commons by just privately saying, you could do this better. I don't need to bring this up and make it a big deal in the press, but you should look at this. And I've even had conservatives from the other side of the floor come over later and say, thank you very much for telling me about that and for not making it a big gotcha moment in the press. Because there's sometimes you're not getting anything done. You've got to make it a big deal publicly. But a lot of times you talk privately, you can get things done. So that gets me down to the last thing I want to talk about, which is how to do politics. And I think there's a real need now to bring different parts of society together, because we're in a situation where when it comes to public policy, when it comes to politics, often people in different parts of society with different views can't even agree on the facts. They can't even agree on what's true and what's not, what's reality. Everybody has their own reality. I hate that. I'm a scientist, like there's one reality, right? We should sit down and figure out what the facts are as best as we can. We can still disagree. We can still have different opinions on what the right thing to do is, but we should at least agree on what the facts are and what the situation, what the reality is. We should have the same reality, because I believe there is such a thing as the reality. So I think that we should be, instead of, so let me just give you an example of how I like to think about things. So right now in politics, we hear some people saying, it's all about freedom. Everybody's got to have freedom, freedom, freedom. And then we hear a lot of people on the another part of the political spectrum saying, it's all about equity, equity. This group needs equity, that group needs equity. And I'd like to add to that, I mean, those are good things. Equality of opportunity, equity, that's important. Freedom, that's important too. But I'd like to talk also, when I'm doing politics, about what responsibility do we have towards each other as citizens of Canada? What responsibility do we have towards each other? And that's motivated by, it's motivated by gratitude. It's not about just freedom or individual rights or equality of opportunity, it's gratitude. So I remember one time in the House of Commons, somebody stood up on the other side, stood up, and I don't even know what liberals stand for at all. So I stood up and said, you know, here's what I think being a liberal means. It means everything that I've accomplished, you know, about half of that can be attributed to my own efforts a lot of the time. But, you know, there's always a half of everything that I've done has to be attributed to my good fortune in having grown up in Canada, I've had a good education, I've been kept healthy, good families, good community, peace, order, just relatively just society, opportunities that were presented to me. So everything that I've accomplished, a good half of the reason why I was able to do it is because of the society that I grew up in that nurtured me. And so I'm grateful for that, and I want to give back. And so I have a responsibility to that society that nurtured me. And that's why I want to help the people who need help in society. And not just the people who need help, but there's different ways to try to make progress in society and make it better. So that's one thing about how I like to do politics. And then the second thing, just to get to maybe the last thing I'll talk about, is it's about an attitude. And what I want to bring to politics is this, what I would call scientific humility. So science has been really successful in the last couple hundred years. And one of the reasons why science is successful is it's always willing to say, we could be wrong. Let's go out and look really hard at the world. Let's do a lot of experiments. So in politics, that means let's go and talk to a lot of people who live differently, different situations. Maybe they live in different places. Maybe they're rich and they're poor, or they live in the city or they live in the country. Let's ask a lot of different people. Let's make observations like scientists make observations to inform us. And let's always be open to being wrong. Like we should always in the back of our head say, are we wrong? Did we get it? Did we like think through things carefully? Always be willing to have somebody walk in the door and say, here's something you missed, and here's why you got to change because you missed something. And it's this attitude, because in politics, the reflex is to say, oh, you know, of course, the Liberal Party is the best. We're always right. And if somebody says we're wrong, well, you know, here, let me give you the explanation. So I think that's the wrong way to do things. The right way to do things, and I know it's the right way because I know science is successful, is this more humble approach, which is to always be ready to be wrong. Always think, you know, we could probably do better. There's probably something we missed. This is the best we have so far, so let's move ahead and implement it. But someday somebody's going to walk in the door, or we're going to go and reach out and talk to somebody and realize that we got something wrong. So we could always be wrong. And I would like to do politics that way, to have that attitude. And, you know, there's a danger because one of these days you're going to change your mind and somebody's going to say, oh, you're a flip-flopper. And so it's my job. I have to do extra work to say, I learned something new. I realized I was wrong about something, and I need to change. So it takes extra communications work to be able to do that. And I believe that if we are successful in doing politics this way, people will come to trust politicians and government more. And that's something we need. We need people that, especially when the government has to make a difficult decision that may be unpopular at first, but really seems like the right thing to do. We need to have the trust of the voters. If you don't do it, the voters have the right. If you don't have that trust, the voters have the right to vote you out next time. But if you really believe that there's a certain right thing to do, sometimes you can't explain it all. You can't convince everybody. You need trust, and I think that's really important. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. What happened since the last provincial election? What are some of the important issues that I'd like to keep tabs on the government about? Of course, there are always a lot of local issues that have come up. They've already come up. I've written some letters of recommendation for a few projects in Kingston, and made contacts with the local resources here to help people. And then the last thing I talked about was how I would like to do politics differently and why that's important. So I always like to be ambitious. So the big ambitious goals. And thank you very much for listening and giving me a chance to talk to you about them today.